All right, we're back. So in this lecture, I'm going to try to briefly go over 8 explanations for why homosexuality persists. Now, they fall into 2 different camps. One is the byproduct camp, and the other is the adaptationist category. Now, a byproduct explanation for homosexuality will, as you know, suggest that homosexuality is not adaptive in and of itself, but is a incidental byproduct of something else which was selected for because of its adaptiveness. The adaptationist explanation would hold that homosexuality is actually adaptive. It confers some sort of fitness advantage and was selected as a result. These are the 8 explanations I'm going to go through. It's actually 7 explanations I'm going to go through. Each of them is interesting in possibly uncovering the apparent mystery of homosexuality, but each is also interesting as an example of the many, many complex dynamics that spin out of the simple mechanics of evolution that we've talked about. So they might be interesting beyond just the topic of homosexuality, because they might be able to explain other things as well. And so I want to talk about all of them, but I want to do so quickly because there's a bunch of them. So let's start off with balancing. If you remember from your grade 9 biology class, each of you inherits a particular gene variant from your mother and one from your father. Now, it's possible these will both be the same version of a particular gene. It's also possible that one of them might have a different variant and you might inherit both versions. If so, there's the possibility you could have a heterozygous genotype for that particular gene locus. Now, in some cases, there may be a rare gene variant that if you carry a single copy of this is genetically advantageous to you. It actually increases your fitness. However, if you happen to inherit 2 copies of that particular rare allele, you will have a negative fitness consequence as a result. So one famous example of this, 2 famous examples are actually in sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is the product of having 2 variants of a particular gene which are the same. If you're a carrier, if you end up being a carrier of both of those, you will have sickle cell anemia. If you're only going to have one of those, it actually offers some sort of defense against malaria that people who didn't have that particular one copy of that gene variant wouldn't have. Similarly, you see a similar pattern for cystic fibrosis. So how does that relate to homosexuality? There is a possibility that homosexual orientation could be caused by, or even just partially increased by, having 2 copies of a particular rare gene variant that if you only had one copy would actually be fitness enhancing for whatever reason. Perhaps it imbues women with some sort of masculine traits, which in small doses actually increases her fertility or her sexual attractiveness or something like that. Or similarly in men, some factor which increases their virility or something. But if you have 2 copies, it actually leads to homosexual orientation for that small tail end of the distribution who happens to inherit 2 copies of the allele. If that's the case, what that means is that homosexual orientation would be the byproduct of whatever it is that is advantageous about having the heterozygous version, about carrying just one version of that allele. Now, there's no specific evidence for this, but it is an interesting possibility about how these types of things can be maintained in the gene pool and not eliminated. If there's a sufficient fitness advantage of having just one copy, it can swamp the effect of a negative fitness cost of having 2 copies in those rare situations. Okay, sexual antagonism, next one. There is this phrase, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, which is to say that, well, if it's good for this group of people, it's also good for this group of people. Often used in the context, well, if it's good for men, it'll also be good for women. In this case, we're turning that expression on its head. We're saying what's good for the goose might not be good for the gander. And why are we saying that? Well, in this case, and this was talked about in the Hode's optional reading, there's been a statistical discovery that the female relatives of gay men actually tend to have higher rates of fertility than the female relatives of straight men. So a trait that's passed down might negatively affect the reproductive success of children of one sex, but might positively affect the reproductive success of children of the other sex, in which case it could again be maintained in the gene pool because it's balanced out, the negative fitness costs, the negative genetic inclusive fitness costs are balanced out by the positive genetic inclusive fitness costs that occur among the descendants of the female half of the family. And so this was the graph that was used in the optional reading. It's shown, again, like I said, the statistical effect, but they've also now found in animal models causal evidence for this, and they did that using fruit flies. What they did is they would selectively breed fruit flies to be homosexually oriented. They would do that by every generation. They would take the male fruit flies that spent the most time with other male fruit flies and just breed those ones over and over again until they became increasingly likely to just spend time with other males. These were the homosexual fruit flies. They would try to copulate with the male fruit flies and really pay no attention to the female fruit flies. What they found was the female relatives of that artificially selected group of homosexually oriented fruit flies, the female ones would actually have better reproductive success than would the female relatives of fruit flies that weren't put through this selection process. Okay, one that's got a lot of attention, this was also mentioned in your readings, is the older brothers hypothesis. This is particularly interesting. Again, it started with a statistical discovery that the more older brothers a man had, the more likely he was to be gay. And so you see this chart, here are the odds of a man being gay depending on his particular family structure. The statistical fact was identified first, and since then, they've been trying to understand the mechanism, which they now have pretty well. So what happens here is that the mother's body, in order to defend herself against the testosterone bath that occurs whenever she has carrying a male child in the womb, she develops these testosterone antibodies to protect her body. These then hang around her body and have an impact on every subsequent child that she carries. The testosterizing of each subsequent fetus is affected by the increasing quantity of testosterone antibodies that are hanging around the mother's womb. And they found this, that the actual relative level of testosterone antibodies in the womb, it increases the likelihood that a male child will turn out to be gay. Now, there's a lot of evidence for this. It can't explain the whole mystery of homosexuality. It doesn't, for instance, explain anything about female homosexuality, but it does appear to be part of the story. This might be the most interesting of all the explanations. So there are these you guys may have heard about this. There's this classic long-running experiment on silver foxes in Russia. What they started doing is breeding foxes selectively for their approachability to humans. Every generation, they would only allow the 20% of the foxes that did best on a particular task of being willing to take food from a human into the next generation. The other 80% wouldn't be bred. And the expectation was that, well, these foxes would become more and more willing to interact with humans. They become tamer, which is, by the way, what happened with dogs, just over a much longer time scale. So that is what happened. The foxes did become tame, but they also developed a whole constellation of traits, including neotenization, which is they became a more juvenile form of themselves, as well as prolonged estrus, so prolonged periods during which the female could get pregnant. They also developed like floppy ears, shorter and fluffier tail. They developed this interesting white patch, which you tend to see across animals as they are bred for this same characteristic. And it's called domestication. We've domesticated these foxes as we've domesticated many other animals. There's speculation that this is how the bonobos were differentiated from regular chimpanzees. They went through a process akin to how we've domesticated humans. They became less aggressive. They became juvenile forms of the chimpanzees. The adult bonobos look more like the juvenile chimpanzees. They engage in play, the same type of play that juvenile chimpanzees engage in, but they do so throughout adulthood. Now, where it gets interesting is this argument that humans have been self-domesticating. We've been domesticating ourselves as a species for millennia. We've become more socially cooperative and less aggressive. We've had less tolerance for the least tame of our species to breed. And as a result, we've been going through the same process of juvenilization or neotenization, breeding for the same sort of traits. And one of those traits is prolonged adult same-sex sexual play. Might be part of the same constellation. You see this in, for instance, juvenile chimpanzees, not adult chimpanzees. You do see it in juvenile bonobos and in adult juvenile bonobos. Actually, I'm not sure. You might also see it in chimpanzees. But the idea is that this is a characteristic of juveniles, which if you increase this neotenization as you self-domesticate a species, it could continue on into adulthood, hence homosexual behavior. Again, doesn't fully explain exclusive homosexual identity, but it does explain why this type of behavior would be something that could genetically evolve. All right, let's now move to the adaptationist explanations for why homosexuality might have evolved. And the first one, which is one you've read about before in your readings, is the kin selection argument. The argument here is that homosexual kin, who instead of pursuing the creation of their own children, would actually be motivated to funnel help and resources to the children of their relatives, thereby increasing their genetic inclusive fitness, but not by having direct children themselves. There is some evidence for this in some remote cultures. You don't see any evidence for it in the industrialized West. So this was what was mentioned in your readings. The studies were done to see whether gay uncles actually invest more in their nieces and nephews, that is the children of their siblings, than do straight uncles. And there was no evidence to support that. However, you could make the argument that, well, the modern West is probably not the best group in which to test this, since what we're really doing is making assumptions about something which evolved in the ancestral environment, in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, which is actually more remote from the West than it is from other cultures. However, there are other issues with this theory, and in particular one that's always troubled me is that if what you're trying to do is develop a helper at the nest, and you're trying to demotivate them from pursuing their own relationships and having their kids, there's no reason for evolution to select for homosexuality rather than something like asexuality. It's possible that the way evolution has worked is that it's just rerouted. Instead of replacing an entire system or leading an entire sexual motivation system to a dead end, it's rerouted just the target, switched it very simply from the target is somebody with whom you could have a fertile relationship that would produce children to one that wouldn't. But if that's the case, then the homosexuality is actually incidental. It is a byproduct of this drive of non-heterosexuality, actually, which would be the thing which is adaptive from a kin selection perspective for this particular explanation. So either way, I find this explanation wanting, but it is an interesting one. And it is one that has an interesting legacy. But I think the other explanations we looked at are probably stronger. And that includes these two about alliance making. These are particularly relevant to female homosexuality. The argument here is that as we see in our close cousins, as we see in bonobos, sex is used not just as a tool for reproducing between you and a heterosexual partner, but it's used for all sorts of other social purposes. In order to, say, forge alliances or make up after a fight, etc. Two examples in which it might have been particularly valuable to leverage same-sex attraction as a way of strengthening the social bonds are in the case of alloparenting and polygyny. Now, alloparenting, which we'll talk about in a future lecture, probably in the intelligence lecture, possibly also in the cooperation lecture, is this idea that raising human children is particularly hard. It's incredibly laborious because it takes a very long time. As a result, humans have specific adaptations in order to share parental duties in a way that other primates don't do very much. If a chimpanzee has a baby, a chimpanzee woman, female has a baby, that baby is on her back for 6 months. She does not let other babies touch it. Bonobos are a little more interested, female bonobos at least are a little more interested in other people's kids. But in humans, if a human woman has a kid, she'll be like offering everybody she meets the opportunity to hold the kid. So that is the product of specific adaptations to share the parenting duties when you can, because they are so massive. One form of social glue which may have allowed women to cement those types of relationships with their female friends is through the use of homosexual behavior. It seems a little icky today to think about that, but it's only because of the cultural taboos that we have on the non-monogamous use of sex. So that's one possibility. Another area in which those types of female-female social bonds were particularly important is in polygamous relationships, women who shared a common single male partner, which has been the default mating arrangement throughout most societies, at least some limited form of polygyny among some subset of the population. Monogamy tends actually to be pretty rare in human societies. Polygyny, where it was a subset of the males that would reproduce, and often would reproduce with multiple females, is the norm. And so if this is something we had recurrently during our ancestral environment, there may have been a lot of pressures to maintain smooth relationships among the women who were sharing a male partner. The argument here is not so much that homosexual behavior was an adaptation. It's that being exclusively heterosexual was evolutionarily costly. It was maladaptive. Women who weren't sexually fluid may have been at a disadvantage in forming and maintaining social relationships between women in polygynous arrangements. They would not have that tool at their disposal for smoothing out relationships. All right, so there's a bunch of possible explanations for homosexuality. They're not all mutually incompatible, and an important thing to note is that they're not all relevant to homosexual orientation among both sexes. Some only make sense for men, like the older brothers hypothesis. Some make a lot more sense for women, like Aloe parenting and polygyny. And that's okay. We don't have to have the same explanation. There's no necessary reason why homosexual behavior in men and women have to be explained by the same evolutionary process. Some concluding thoughts about this. So one is that the trade-off here is that homosexuality would persist if its benefits outweighed its costs, either its direct benefits or the benefits of the adaptations that it is a byproduct of. Now, that, I think, makes particular sense in the context of female homosexuality. And the reason for that is something that we haven't talked about yet in the course, which is concealed ovulation. This is something which is not something you see among many mammals, but you do see it among humans. The time in a female's reproductive cycle when she is most likely to be able to conceive is usually advertised through smells or through reddening of the genitals or whatever, such that the males know to reproduce with this female now, and the female knows that she should be reproducing as well. In humans, that's not the case. Even though women are significantly, much more likely to conceive during small windows of their menstrual cycle, there's no obvious outward indication when that is. We now know it because we figured it out, but in the ancestral environment, it wasn't clear to people when that was. There are a lot of explanations for why that might be. The consensus explanation seems to be that it's a way of recruiting male investment across the month, so you don't have males who are just willing to, say, offer resources and protection during those few days during the month when she is able to be impregnated, and instead they hang around the whole time offering resources and protection to the woman and the offspring. The reason this is relevant is because for large periods of the month then, women don't pay a cost for not pursuing heterosexual sex. The sex that they would be having during that time of the month wouldn't lead to reproduction anyways. As a result, sex doesn't have to only serve its reproductive purpose. It can serve other purposes as well. Any benefits you get from that have few costs that are paid for not being reproductively viable sex. What seems to require more explanation then is exclusively homosexual individuals, especially men. As I mentioned at the top of these lectures, we don't see that very much in nature at all. As a result, what we see among humans is a peculiarity. Now, there's a lot of things that are peculiar about humans, and so there might be good explanations for this. But one thing we haven't talked about, and one thing that I'm hoping we can talk about during one of the discussion classes, is the role of culture in all this. How have our norms and expectations and stigmas affected the way that homosexuality plays out in our society? The other thing that bears mentioning is that even though this is a pretty large wealth of research that we've covered, you can clearly tell that it's still in its infancy. There are a lot of hypotheses being thrown up here which are waiting to be tested to see if they can be discarded because, say, the premises are wrong or the predictions turn out to be incorrect. There has been no silver bullet explanation for homosexuality. Maybe there won't be, but maybe there will be in the future. Maybe that's something that's coming down the pike, and maybe it's one of you guys who is going to do it. All right, guys, that's the lecture on homosexuality. Sorry there's been so much content for this week, but I'm looking forward to discussing it all on Wednesday. See you guys then.